Many people kind of crash into development through something awful, right? Which is generally something about how our current way of making sense of the world breaks, and often catastrophically. Our partner leaves us, or we get fired, or we lose a parent, or something catastrophic happens, and we cannot make sense of it. And so we have to kind of grow a new way to make sense, or else stay kind of bitter and shrunk. And I had this idea that if people knew that they had a map, and they knew that they were following a map, then they could start upgrading the map kind of all the time, right? You wouldn't have to like crash into this difficulty.
Okay, Jennifer, welcome to the show. To get started, can you tell us, is there anything that you believe about coaching that might go against the conventional wisdom or that most others in the field might not be aware of?
That's a great question. Thanks. Um, yeah, I this might go against the conventional wisdom. I tend to think that coaches try too hard to add value to their clients, and that if we spent a little bit less time trying to add value and more time really just being with our clients, that we might paradoxically add more value.
Ooh, interesting. Okay. Now, I heard a talk that you gave, I think it was a couple of years ago, and you said something that really jumped out at me. So I wanted to ask you about this. In essence, it was that light casts shadows and shadows cast light. Can you maybe expand on this for us?
Yeah, I think that people know instinctively that the overuse of something casts a shadow, right? That every characteristic each of us has, even if we think of it as our finest quality, if we overuse that finest quality, we get into shadowy territory. The thing that's been more of a surprise for me as I've worked with my clients is that it's often the things we're afraid of about ourselves. um, One client who's afraid of being arrogant, one client who's afraid of looking stupid, one client that's afraid of looking passive. Like these fears we have about what might be our shadowy sides actually keep us, they limit our range quite significantly. And sometimes dialing up like 2 or 3% of our shadow actually gives us space to be a fuller version of ourselves.
That's so interesting. And in terms of, dialing up that extra 2 or 3% and helping your clients develop more of that range, have you found anything to be helpful in that regard?
So the first thing is for them to notice that they're doing it. We need to notice what pieces of ourselves we're afraid of. It's often something that in our childhood, our parents told us wasn't okay, or our first boss really looked down on, or sometimes it's something that we've gotten a lot of feedback about. And so it's a part of ourselves that we kind of squish into a little box. Finding out what that is really helpful. And then noticing how that thing, keeping it in a little box, actually limits something that might be good. And then tiny little experiments to be willing for, to be willing for people to think you are 1% more arrogant by standing up for what you believe in, or 1% more pushy, or like whatever the word is that you're afraid people will think of you. Could you try something that would scare you just a little bit to try it and lean a little into it?
That's a really powerful idea and not something I think I've ever heard before. So thanks for sharing that. Something cool that you mentioned in that talk as well was the work of Daniel Gilbert from Harvard. He talks about this idea that human beings are works in progress that mistakenly think we're finished. And for me, I think this is one of the most important ideas in all of psychology, because we really do feel that. We feel that the person that we're very different from the person we were 10 years ago. But if you ask someone, what will you be like in 10 years from now? They say, oh, pretty much the same. It's the end of history illusion, I think you call it. Well, have you, in your work with clients, have you found any ways to sort of overcome that? Any ways to sort of get them to see that they are works in progress and they're very much they are likely to be very different 10 years in the future?
I mean, just calling out, I love the way Daniel Gilbert calls this the end of history illusion. Like history stops now. And everything that's been true up until now, no longer true. Like a whole new world is starting. I love this idea. Often when I call clients' attention to it, it's quite arresting, right? They're very surprised about that idea. And, I'm a developmentalist. And so I offer some theory of adult development that says over time we grow, we progress, we move towards what you might think of as wisdom, and that we're either on that journey on purpose or we're kind of on the sidelines of that journey by mistake. And with the world moving so fast as it is right now, kind of getting off of a developmental trajectory seems pretty dangerous right now. It seems like we could use all the wisdom that we could figure out how to amass. And so staying on a developmental trajectory seems helpful.
For sure, for sure. It's no longer a luxury, it's a necessity. Um, so in your conversation with Sheehan Parish, you said something that really jumped out at me, and I'm just gonna read it out here. So much of what we're doing is an answer to a question. Our lives are living in answers to questions that we don't even notice we're asking. So if you ask different questions, it can help you to lead a different life. So can you expand on this a little? And this is a two-part question. So are there any questions that you find helpful to ask yourself regularly, whether it be on a daily or a weekly or a monthly or an annual basis, that you find these really help me to sort of stay on track?
Yeah. So this comes from a book I wrote with my dear friend, Keith Johnston. And this idea about asking different questions, noticing what questions we're asking, even if we're asking them implicitly, and then intentionally asking different questions. Like, just as if we look at the end of history illusion, which we were just talking about, the question people don't know that they're asking, but that we're often implicitly asking is kind of, how can I not learn from this? How can I stay the same? How can I not be unsettled? How can it look like I already knew this already? How can I not be surprised? Like there's this whole part of our psychology that's all the time like conspiring to have us look very cool, and like it's very effortless and nothing surprises us. We've put thousands of leaders on videotape and then told them something quite surprising, and their faces are almost always like, yeah, okay, but let's just carry on. Like they just don't attend. And so I think a question that I carry with me that I try to help my clients carry with them is this question, like, who am I becoming? And who am I wanting to be becoming? And then what choices actually are part of that becoming, right? Like people think they ask themselves a question, should I take this job or should I stay in my current position? Like that's the question they think they're asking. But if they ask a question like, who do I want to be becoming? Then they can ask the question, and which of these job possibilities furthers or has the possibility to further my journey as the person I'm trying to become? And it just changes changes the whole, it elevates the entire conversation about what am I on about?
I really like that. So you've sort of there's that's a two-part question. The first part is who am I becoming, and the other part of that is who do I want to become. And if you're clear on the second part, who you want to become, then that can have a massive influence on your decisions in the present because you know that's going to tweak my trajectory in such a way that I get closer to the person that I'd like to become.
That's right. And I think we could stand to ask ourselves that question every week, every day, every time we're faced with something really tricky. Um, every time we run into a piece of ourselves that we don't feel that good about, every time we run into somebody else who annoys us, who do I want to become such that I can deal with this person in a new way? I think that question is filled with possibilities.
For sure. It reminds me of one James Clear talks about. He a question he asks himself regularly is, can my current habits carry me towards the future I want? Something like that. And it's a similar thought experiment. Um, Another cool idea. You've got a lot of really cool ideas, Jennifer, I have to say. Another one is you actually referenced Thomas Hubble, who I've interviewed. But it was a difficulty arising in me, or a difficulty arising is a sign of an edge in me. Can you maybe explain your or the thinking here?
I love Thomas's thinking in this. Um, I was in a supervision group with him for a few years, and people would bring their challenges. We're all coaches, and we would bring what we would think of as like problem clients or difficult clients. We would bring these to Thomas, and Thomas would always help us reframe this and understand that clients are never difficult. Clients are clients. Other humans are other humans. They're doing their thing. When they occur to us as difficult, that's something in us that can't quite rise to meet the occasion of what's going on for them. And so the question is always when you reach into difficulty out there is what needs to grow in here to resolve the difficulty out there. And it's such a helpful framing, I think. And I think it's a piece of one of the things I really care about is how do we metabolize our difficulties into development? How do we use conflict and confusion uh, and hard stuff in our lives to actually stretch into the next version of ourselves? And this question Thomas asks is so helpful in that regard, because otherwise you can have a relationship to the outside world like, oh, I can't believe she did that, or I can't believe he's like that, or I can't believe this thing happened to me. Or you could say, oh, wow, I wonder what in me could grow to meet that thing that happened, that thing that she said, or that thing that he did, or that thing that happened.
Powerful. So metabolizing difficulties into development. And it seems to me that if you have this basic frame whenever you do encounter your edge, then it enables you to go from maybe an older part of the brain, a more emotional, a more reactive part, and it could actually lead to a state of curiosity about which then can be helpful for actually changing the behavior. So you're sort of maybe activating a newer part of the brain even by having this question in mind.
I think that's right. I think you're activating, and I think you're calling on whatever your highest capacity is up until now, right? You're calling on that intentional, growing, open part of yourself. And it also gives you so much more power, right? If what she does annoys you and then she does it tomorrow, you're going to be annoyed tomorrow. And then again the next day and again the next day, like you're kind of at her mercy. But if what she does shows you a thing you could grow into, then you grow into it. And then she could do the same thing next week and it doesn't bother you anymore because you're in a different place with it. And you get the power of the response.
You could be really extreme with this, and you could like say there is a coworker or a colleague that really does get under your skin, and you could literally be like, okay, this person is the biggest gift in my life because this person is going to help me to grow and get beyond this thing that I'm carrying internally. And if I can be okay with this person, then that's, you know, I won't have this problem again in future.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And it opens up so many possibilities. I mean, it might be that you're annoyed about that coworker because he reminds you of your dad and something your dad did when you were little, and it just gets in your way. And he's a perfectly good guy. Or it might be he's not that nice a guy. He's really not a nice guy. And he's going to walk through the world in that way. But you don't have to be triggered by it. And you can just let him walk through the world and you can do you and he can do him. And it'll all be okay.
I like that. I like that. You can do you and he can do him and it'll be all be okay. Okay, so you are probably most well known for your work on adult development theory. For anybody hearing about this for the first time, what would you say the essence of adult development theory is and why this is so important for us to understand?
Well, I think we know so much about how young people develop. Like, like everybody who interacts with a child has a sense of how that child is different in some way than a grown up. And then we act as though, like, when we happen to get a certain height or whatever, a certain age, that all that difference ends. And so, even though we have like a vague idea of that person is more mature, like that 40-year-old is wise beyond his 8 years, and that 30-year-old is immature in some way. Like we have that kind of a sense, but we can't really give form to it. And we certainly can't figure out how do I be one of those and not the other one of those. Adult development theory helps us understand what is it that grows in us. Like how is it that our meaning grows, that our capacity to deal with complexity or ambiguity or difficulty grows? And then what could I do to try to advance my own growth and to support the growth of people around me? So, in a world that is constantly calling on us to be kind of wiser, more capable, more able to handle a ton of difficulty and confusion, knowing about how that happens seems important to me.
For sure. And a key part of this is the four minds. Could you give us just a brief snapshot of each mind, just so people have a lay of the land?
Sure. So, and these are, a brief snapshot. These are human beings. And so I'm going to caricature things terribly. Um, but if we're going to take like a very rough outline, there's a time in our life, generally earlier in our lives, where the best we can do is kind of be in ourselves and guess about what goes on for somebody else. Like I could just take a guess. I can't actually take your perspective if it's different from mine. I'm just like, Niall's probably thinking these things. And it's important to me to understand that he's thinking those things because Niall has something I want. And I need to like somehow get what I want. And so this is this earlier mind. I call it the self-sovereign mind because it's like I am the queen of my dominion, but I'm also the only person in my dominion. It's like a dominion of one. Um, and then over time, that gets a little small and a little tricky to maintain and a little lonely. And so there's a way our minds open up to each other and we begin to subordinate what I most want to something in a collective. What would be how would all the other lawyers also think about this? Or how would all the other people in my religion think about this? Or how would all the other people I like to follow on Instagram think about this? Like we choose some group and we use that group as our guidance system. and we kind of breathe in that group and take it inside us. And then that group tells us what to do, who to be, how to be, what success looks like. And I and many other theorists call that the socialized mind, because we can finally socialize ourselves, because I can put what I want to the side for what's good for us. And this was probably one of the crowning achievements of humanity, and probably makes it possible for us to do so many of the great things humans have been able to do, because we're not all scrabbling for just me anymore. We're in us. And then over time, particularly in a really complex world, that group probably isn't enough. Like the group of, if I'm like trying to be the perfect lawyer, it doesn't help me figure out how to be a mom, or how to be a community member, or an environmentalist, or any of the other things that might also matter to me. And it might be really confusing for me to try to be that and that and that and that. It's like too much. And so there's no one group eventually that can kind of tell us what to be. And that's the moment when we realize we need to pick up the pen and write our own story. Many theorists call that the self-authored form of mind, right? When I am the one who chooses in this moment, how do I want to show up? How do I want to be? What are my values? What's most important to me? That's in this self-authored space. I'm like writing myself. That's how I do it. And in some cases, not that often, but increasingly often, in fact, even that becomes a little bit too small, because we don't live in a world where I can actually just write my own story by myself. We live in a very enmeshed, entwined world. And we are kind of co-writing our story, and other people are co-writing our story, and we're co-writing their story. And there's all this interaction between the context that's also making me up and the way I'm making up the context. It's more symbiotic than just self-authored. And we call that the self-transforming mind, because then the whole world exists as a thing that helps us grow. And every interaction is a potential growth space.
Wow. Wow. So in that last stage, like culture's flowing into us, but we're also flowing out into culture. It's this transactional thing between us. Um, for someone listening to this and they're curious to know where they sit on this map, what's the most effective way to find out, would you say?
I mean, I think the inquiry itself, this is one of those questions that I think is really helpful, is to notice what's making me up right now. Like, how do I know? How do I know which choice to make? What am I listening to? Am I listening to something out there? Am I listening to something? Am I listening to what my friends tell me? Am I listening to something that I saw on LinkedIn that looked like what successful people do? Am I looking at my values? Am I grabbing ideas from a whole bunch of places and kind of laying them before me and making a collage? Like, what am I doing? And I think that inquiry is really useful. And uh, I think just the inquiry itself advances our growth.
So it's almost like looking at your desires, but then looking at the process by which those desires were formed. Was it formed by you looking at somebody else doing something? I want that too. Or was it by looking inside and these are my values? Or was it looked by seeing how can we create a better society or culture together? Like these kind of motivations that shape desires. That's what we're kind of looking at almost.
Yeah, we often like look at the world as if we're seeing the world. I mean, and it sounds crazy to say that we're not seeing the world, but actually everything we know about both psychology and neuroscience says we are really not seeing the world. We're seeing a kind of projection of a tiny, tiny piece of the world. And if we get really curious about why is my attention drawn to that thing? Um, what, why am I why am I doing these behaviors? Like, what is the reason for me to care about that? All of these questions help us kind of examine ourselves in a more, I don't know, I think the word that's coming to my mind is productive, a more productive way. But probably there are many ways to examine yourself that are productive. But this is a productive way of like examining, why am I making the sense that I'm making? Because then you can start to like mess with the operating system itself instead of just being like, I make sense this way, which you can't mess with anything if that's just true.
For sure. Now let's hypothetically imagine that you're working with a leader and you both kind of agree that they're at the stage of maybe a self-authoring mind. And this person has a sincere desire to maybe move to the self-transforming mind. How would you help that person make that leap?
I do a lot of that work actually. A lot of the leaders who come to me are in that space and they're trying to figure out, how do I do that? The first thing we often look at are this person's certainties. Like, what do you know for sure? And then a question that's really helpful is, and how could you be wrong about those things that you know for sure? Not to knock you off your perch, but just everything you know for sure is kind of it's a block in some way, right? It's a thing you've stopped being curious about. It's a place you can't grow into. And so this question of like, what do I know for sure and how could I be wrong about that, is an opening to a new possibility of exploration. And it is that falling in love with exploring what else is possible is just a key piece of what it means to be in the self-transforming mind. So that's one of the ways.
I really like that. The something you said there, I can't quite remember what it was, but it reminded me of this idea from Ken Wilber. It's just essentially he sees that there are validity in all perspectives. And if you have that basic frame, then you live in a less threatening world because you can learn from anybody, and I think that's just such a valuable thing to keep in mind because the person that you most have least in common with, you probably have the most to learn from because there is some form of truth in their perspective. You just have to dig a little to find it. Have you thought of any potentially really useful applications of this theory, Jennifer? And as I was formulating that question, an idea came to mind. I was like, do you know what? If they had some kind of assessment that politicians had to take, and you had to qualify as a self-transforming mind to become a politician in society, it'd probably change the world. Like if that was the criteria, like you would have a lot less trouble in the world. Have you thought like much about how this could be applied to really improve the world?
Yeah, I think about it a lot. Um, and I guess it's why I guess my life's work has been helping people grow, right? Helping people figure out if that's what they want to do. And if it is what they want to do, then helping them do it. So I think just the notion that we could be bigger, we could have more capacity than we have today is such a helpful idea. Like people sometimes say, well, Jennifer, isn't that a really judgmental idea? Like, aren't you judging people all the time? And for me, I think people are judging people all the time. I think people are constantly judging people all the time. For me, the the promise and hope of a kind of developmental stance is the idea that we could be better, right? We could be different, we could be bigger, we could be more capable tomorrow than we were yesterday. And for me, that's so hopeful. Like, I'm not just saddled with the particular personality or set of skills or capabilities and ways of thinking about the world that I have today, which might be too limited. You talk about politicians. I think a ton of what's going on in the world right now is people are afraid they're confused. And because they're afraid and confused, they actually drop back to some earlier stage where they need things to be more black and white, more certain, and they are more self-protective. There's something that happens under these conditions of fear that activate earlier parts of ourselves. And so if we don't know that's happening, we just believe it.
So you had a cancer diagnosis at 43, I believe. How did this influence your developmental trajectory?
Oh, wow. It changed so much. It changed so much. Yeah, I was diagnosed with breast cancer for the first time at 43 and then again at 45. So I had breast cancer twice. Um, I think the thing that it did is it helped me understand um, that the limitations we put in our own minds are just exhausting and time consuming. and like when you are sick or when you see like the envelope of your life creeping closer to your eyes, there's a lot of stuff that you don't have time for. You don't have time to be so self-protective. You don't have time to be so afraid. And because you got to try stuff like the whole idea that we'll get to it tomorrow is pretty much gone for me, right? Like we'll get to it today. Like let's figure out how to try now. And so I think a ton of the choices I've done, which have been scary and developmental, a lot of those choices come from that diagnosis and from also I think there's one more thing I'll say there, which I'm not sure I've articulated before, but like to go through, I had like 7 surgeries and chemotherapy and radiotherapy, and um, you really want to live. Like it's a real commitment to living and to not sleepwalking through life, but like I really fought to stay. And and I think that changes how I live because I remember I picked this. Like I put quite some effort into choosing to to fight as hard as I could to stay alive. And and I think that changes the contract I have with life in a way.
Amazing. And in terms of we've all got a meaning making system. How do you think that influenced what you derive meaning from in the world, or if at all? Maybe it didn't. I don't know.
No, I think it absolutely does. It put me in touch with the fact that every single human life is like incredibly precious. Every being is incredibly precious. And at the same time, we are collectively, each of us is really small. And so, this idea that each of us is both incredibly precious and really small really redoubled my desire for us to do things together well, right? Can we be in communities in different ways? Can organizations pull out, create the conditions for our best in a different way? Can organizations themselves serve the planet and communities in a different way? Can communities serve everybody in their community in a different way? So it something about understanding how precious and also tiny each individual life is, and then being committed to both protecting that and also expanding that so that our lives together have more meaning. That also arose from that space.
It makes me think, you know, we're all walking around the world with our own, mental models of how things are, how things should be. And when you have an experience like this or any kind of extreme event, it can scramble those models so that the previous ways you were looking at the world no longer make sense anymore. And out of that, you can either just stay in that place of chaos, or you can develop new, bigger maps that are more encompassing and more, maybe less individualistic almost. I don't know. That's kind of what's come to mind. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think one of the great mysteries, I think, is what distinguishes between those two states that you've just described. Like some people have, just even a near accident. It doesn't even have to be an accident, or they have something almost happen to them, or they face into an illness or something like that, and they are changed and they live a bigger life because of it. And some people can have exactly the same experience and somehow retreat or like double down or not question, not grow from it. And this has been, kind of one of my inquiries, is how do we help make growth a more possible choice for people who might be afraid of it, not be able to picture what it looks like, not have the first couple handholds to make sense. I think I was so lucky to be an adult developmentalist when I got cancer. I mean, it's just like set me up so well to have this be a meaningful experience, not an experience I would ever want, not an experience I would ever want anybody else to have, but like I was so used to the study of meaning that I understood how to make meaning from this thing. Um, I, I think we could all study our own meaning, and then we would be able to make more meaning from our lives.
It's incredible. So with, whenever these experiences happen where we do have that scrambling of the mental models and we have this transformation, well, not everybody does, but the people that do, um, it sort of strikes me that that's kind of the name of the game almost, is like to be continuously upgrading our mental models and mental maps throughout life so that I don't think we're ever going to properly, they're ever going to properly reflect the territory, but it's trying to get closer and closer as close as we could to the territory. So the question then becomes, and I think this is kind of the essence of the work you do, is like, how do you help people continuously upgrade their mental maps? And how do you develop that mental complexity so that it's constantly evolving without the need for the major crisis, the major disorienting dilemma, I think you call it.
I mean, this is why I wrote my first book, Changing on the Job, all these years ago, is because I had basically this theory that you've just expressed, which is many people kind of crash into development through something awful, right? Which is generally something about how our current way of making sense of the world breaks, and often catastrophically. Our partner leaves us, or we get fired, or we lose a parent, or something catastrophic happens and we cannot make sense of it. And so we have to kind of grow a new way to make sense, or else stay kind of bitter and shrunk. um and I had this idea that if people knew that they had a map, and they knew that they were following a map, then they could start upgrading the map kind of all the time, right? You wouldn't have to like crash into this difficulty. It's like your relationship with your partner is going along, and then there's tension, and maybe you can't deal with it, and then the tension gets worse, and maybe you can't deal with it, and then the tension gets worse, and then the thing falls apart. Or you and your partner are having a relationship and there's tension, because there's always tension in every relationship if you notice it. And you notice that there's tension and you think, oh, I can't handle that. And you figure out how to handle it. You have therapy, you grow, you learn new conversation patterns, you learn to listen in a different way. And now you can handle more tension. And then life, and then you have kids, and then that's more tension. And if you grow every time you need to, then you don't have to crash apart, right? Like it doesn't have to break. But you have to know that you could be engaged in this process of your continual growth, and that the thing that you treasured 10 years ago might be different than the thing that you treasure today, and is almost certainly going to be different than the thing that you treasure in 10 years, about yourself, about your life, about what you've accomplished, all these things. And we cling on to those, and we don't want to put them down because they make us feel safe. And probably what they're doing is they're putting us at risk.
Definitely, definitely. And you talk about habits that we can kind of develop to grow in mental complexity, and one of them is um, it's seeing in others' perspectives, or is taking in multiple perspectives. Um, so for someone that would love to be great at taking in other people's perspectives, like, are there any practices you've found for strengthening that muscle?
So again, the first thing you do is you notice that you're not doing it. Because I have so many people who are like, oh, I take people's perspectives so well. And I tend to ask a question like, is there somebody in your life you think of as an idiot? And people are always like, oh, yeah. And the answer is you are not taking that person's perspective, right? Because that person does not think of herself as an idiot, right? She doesn't get up in the morning and think I'm going to be stupid today, right? Like she thinks I'm doing a good job. And so when you see her in this way, then that's some lack of perspective taking on your part. It's back to your Wilbur question of, can you learn from everybody? I think yes. I think yes. And can you learn from somebody who has a perspective that you really dislike? Yeah, because there's probably some piece of truth in that perspective that you dislike that would expand or augment your view of the world. And so the first thing is to find out, whose perspective am I not taking? And you look for that by thinking, that person got up this morning to piss me off, or like that person gets in my way all the time, or that person lives in order to frustrate me, whatever. And it might be smaller than that. Like that guy never adds value in a meeting, whatever it is. And then you wonder, how is that person a hero in his own story? Right? What does he say to himself when he looks in the mirror in the morning? What does he say to himself? What does he say to himself about you? What does he say to himself about that meeting? And as you like stretch into that, you actually see so much more potential for how we can be together, for how we can interact, for how we can see a bigger set of solutions, for how we can innovate in new ways. I mean, there's just so much that lives between my perspective and your perspective that we could use as the ingredients for some goodness in the future.
That strikes me as a bit of a superpower. Like, if you can do that, you just have such an advantage in life, you know? So another thing that you are, I think you written in the second edition of one of your recent books, about about how to essentially give and take feedback in the most effective way. Have you any thoughts for someone that particularly someone who's maybe conflict avoidant, about how best to approach feedback?
Yeah, as somebody who's conflict avoidant, I have thought a lot about that question. Um, I I think that one of the things to hold on to is that your perspective is useful and not necessarily true. And if you hold it as useful and not necessarily true, then you can also get curious about the other person's perspective, which is similarly useful and not necessarily true. And the thing for us all to remember as we're giving and receiving feedback is that none of us owns the truth here. And so somebody who's giving you feedback about how you didn't show up with strength and clarity in that meeting, probably there's something true about that. Is it as true as that person thinks it is? I don't know. That's up for debate. When I have a piece of feedback for somebody else and it feels really true to me, is it all the way true? No, it's not all the way true. It's the way I feel about it right now. It's the pieces I put together, and then there are pieces you put together, and we have to put those pieces together in a larger table for us to actually figure out what's going on. And so I think if we didn't think about it as like, oh, I have to be sure that I'm right. As somebody who's conflict avoidant, I can tell you that one of the questions that naturally arrives for me is, am I sure I'm right about this? Because I don't want to say anything unless I'm sure I'm right. But actually, there's no such thing as that. It's like not a helpful question. The helpful question is, would having this conversation with this person serve to expand both of our perspectives and have the potential to deepen our relationship? And if I can say yes to that, I don't have to be right. I can just say, hey, there's this thing, it bothered me. I'm not even totally sure why it bothered me, but I'd love to share it with you and get your perspective on it so that we could work it through and have a better relationship. Like if we took feedback that way, then I think it would be a better world.
That's another superpower. Essentially letting go of the need to be right, and it sort of links back to what you were saying earlier about the questions. You know, like the default question or the implicit question that someone might be asking themselves in a relationship is like, "How can I be right in this situation?" And they don't even know they're asking it. Whereas if you know that the real question that you want to answer is, "How can I deepen this relationship?" or "How can I strengthen this bond?" then it leads to a totally different approach, and it's maybe a little bit more uncomfortable, but definitely going to lead to a lot more happiness over a longer stretch of time. You know?
Yeah. And these things that you're calling superpowers, by the way, I totally agree. And the thing I'm here to say is anybody can grow them. Like you might not be able to grow the superpower of invisibility or like being able to leap from tall buildings in a single bound or whatever it is, but you can absolutely grow the superpower of perspective taking. You can absolutely grow the superpower of letting go of needing to be right. Like those things are growable. Anybody can grow them if they want to.
For sure, for sure. Okay, so one question just to wrap up, Jennifer. Talking about perspective taking, are there any perspectives that you hold now, and you're quite, I know you don't like certainty, but you know they're pretty solid. Is there anything that you know now that you maybe wish you had have adopted earlier in life? Anything that's important to you now that you wish you had have taken more seriously earlier?
That's a great question. This whole space of conflict and how conflict can be generative. It's taken me a long time to get to a place where I'm really, really willing to believe that most conflict, if you handle it well, is relationship deepening and possibility opening and not just terrifying. And if I had had that, I, I sort of theoretically knew that it was true. I've known it's true for a long time. Um, but the practice of it, like the constant practice of it. I live in an intentional community now. And so 12 friends and I bought a big house together and we live together. And then there's a lot of stuff, right, that arises with 12 people trying to like figure out dishes and power and um, how to keep the building cool, like whatever it is, all the things. And whether we belong or not, whatever it is. Um, and so we have to engage, we have to work through conflict all the time, all the time. It's like all the time. And if you do it well, and we study it, you study it. If you do it well, if you make a study of it, it deepens your relationships, and your relationships just get deeper and deeper and deeper. It's so much less scary than I thought it was.
So you're essentially in a laboratory for studying conflict there as a,
That's exactly right.
what's the word for that? Participant observer in an experiment. What's the word?
Yeah. Like a social anthropologist.
Exactly. Yeah.
Conflict and love, right? Those two things go together. You really can't have one without the other. We do a lot of conflict without love in the world, but that's not generative conflict. And we can try to do love without conflict, but that's probably not generative love. So how do we do a thing that stretches us and grows us and helps us make each other bigger? I think that's the human question right now. How do we deal with our differences in a way that grows our possibilities rather than being literally at war with each other, or ceding it all to robots and saying, I won't deal with any of that. I'll just have robots, like they can work it out. I think there's a profoundly human way for us to really expand into our differences and make use of them to deal with some of the largest challenges the human race has ever faced.
For sure. Okay. Well, Jennifer, I've learned so much preparing for this and speaking with you. Like it's been an amazing experience. So I just want to say thank you so much. Where can people learn more about your work, get your books, and where would you send them after this conversation?
So we have a website, cultivatingleadership.com, and my friends and colleagues and I write there. We post things. We have 1 million free videos, articles, blogs. We really believe in giving stuff away. All my books are published by Stanford University Press, so you can go to Stanford and see what you got. It's also on Kindle and all the other online retailers. And you have prepared more for this than I have ever seen anybody. I've done a lot of podcasts, and your preparation has been so much fun. And I have to say, very flattering to have you, like, you've really looked across the stuff I've done and asked incredibly interesting questions. So I've never had a podcasting experience like this, and I'm really grateful.
I appreciate that. Well, you've left quite a trail behind you, so it's easy to prepare. So anyway, I'll let you go. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much.